The silence was as much a part of Harper Lyndon as her shadow, trailing behind her through the parched Arizona dust of 1887, a voiceless ghost of the woman she once had been. Her wagon creaked to a halt at the edge of Promise Creek, the small frontier town that would either be her salvation or another stop on an endless journey running from memories that refused to stay buried. Harper's hands trembled slightly as she secured her horse, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the main street. 3 years of silence had become her armor, her penance, her prison. Not that anyone in Promise Creek would know her story. That was the beauty of starting over in a town where no one knew your name or the tragedy that stole your voice. The saloon door swung open, spilling light and raucous laughter onto the street. Harper flinched at the sudden noise, her eyes darting nervously toward the commotion. A tall man emerged, his silhouette framed by the golden light behind him. Unlike the drunken patrons stumbling around him, he moved with purpose and quiet confidence. "Madam," he said with a polite nod as he passed her wagon. "You need assistance with that trunk." Harper shook her head quickly, eyes downcast. The stranger paused, his spurs jingling softly in the evening air. "Name's Dawson Miller," he offered, removing his hat to reveal dark hair and eyes that crinkled slightly at the corners when he spoke. "Town's blacksmith and part-time deputy. You planning to stay in Promise Creek?" Harper nodded, reaching for the small slate and chalk she kept tied at her waist. With practiced movements, she wrote a single word, "Harper." Dawson read it without comment on her method of communication. "Well, Harper, Mrs. Winters rents rooms above the general store. Clean place, fair price." He gestured down the street. "I'd be happy to walk you there." Harper hesitated, then nodded again. There was something about his steady gaze that didn't demand explanations. His eyes didn't hold pity or suspicion, just patience, as though he had all the time in the world to wait for whatever she might want to say. As they walked the short distance to the general store, Dawson kept a respectful distance. "Promise Creek isn't much," he said, "but the people are decent folk mostly. We get the occasional troublemaker passing through, but nothing Sheriff Tanner can't handle." Harper listened, finding unexpected comfort in his deep, measured voice. When they reached Mrs. Winters' boarding house, Dawson tipped his hat. "If you need anything, my shop's just past the livery. Welcome to Promise Creek, Harper." She wrote a simple thank you on her slate, and he nodded as though they'd had the most normal conversation in the world. That night, in her sparse rented room, Harper unpacked her few belongings and the tools of her trade. Her fingers lingered on the beautiful leather-bound ledger and the stack of carefully maintained accounting books. Before the incident that took her voice, she had been a respected bookkeeper in St. Louis, with a gift for numbers that had once made her indispensable. Her chalk scratched against the slate in the dimly lit room. Tomorrow begins again. Dawn broke over Promise Creek with the promise of scorching heat. Harper dressed carefully in her high-necked blouse and practical skirt, her honey-blonde hair pinned severely at her nape. With her ledgers and references tucked into a leather satchel, she ventured out to seek work. The general store owner, Mr. Keller, barely glanced at her slate when she presented her qualifications. "Don't need no woman's help with my figures," he said dismissively. "My boy does the counting just fine." The saloon owner laughed outright. "A mute woman bookkeeper, that's rich, though I suppose the not talking would be a benefit." By midday, Harper's hopes had dimmed considerably. She sat on a bench outside the post office, shoulders slumped in defeat when a shadow fell across her. "Not having much luck?" Dawson Miller asked, settling beside her with a respectful distance between them. Harper shook her head, then wrote on her slate, "No one wants a bookkeeper who can't speak." Dawson read it and frowned. "Their loss. Numbers don't need a voice to be right." He seemed to consider something before continuing. "Town council's meeting tonight. They've been complaining about the mess of the town's accounts since old Mr. Finley passed last winter. Might be worth showing up." That evening, Harper sat nervously at the back of the small town hall as Mayor Tompkins called the meeting to order. When the discussion turned to the disarray of the town's financial records, she gathered her courage and walked forward, slate in hand. "What's this?" Mayor Tompkins asked, peering at her through spectacles too small for his round face. Harper held up her slate. "I can help with the accounts." Experienced bookkeeper from St. Louis. The mayor squinted at her writing, then at her face. "You're the woman staying at Mrs. Winter's place, the one who doesn't speak." Before Harper could write a response, Dawson stood from his place along the wall. "I can vouch for her character, Mayor. Met her yesterday when she arrived." "You known her long enough to vouch for her, Miller?" Sheriff Tanner asked skeptically. "I know honest eyes when I see them," Dawson replied simply. "And we need someone who understands bookkeeping, unless you're volunteering, Sheriff." The room filled with chuckles as the sheriff grimaced. Everyone knew Tanner could barely add up poker winnings, let alone manage town accounts. 2 weeks, the mayor finally declared. "You have 2 weeks to prove yourself, miss." Harper quickly wrote Lyndon on her slate. "Miss Lyndon. If your work is satisfactory, we'll discuss a more permanent arrangement." Walking back to her boarding house under a canopy of stars, Harper felt the first flicker of hope she'd experienced in years. The slate in her hands had been enough, at least for today. "Mind if I walk with you?" Dawson's voice came from behind her, and Harper turned to find him a few paces back. His expression impossible to read in the darkness. She nodded, and they fell into step together. "Counsel can be a stubborn lot," he said after a while, "but they're fair. You show them what you can do, they'll come around." Harper stopped and wrote on her slate. "Why are you helping me?" Dawson read it, then looked at her with those steady eyes that seemed to see more than she wanted to reveal. "Everyone deserves a chance to be useful, to belong somewhere." He paused. "I know what it's like to start over in a strange place." Something in his tone made Harper believe him. She wrote again, "Thank you." "Nothing to thank me for yet," he said with a small smile, "but I hope Promise Creek gives you what you're looking for." As the days passed, Harper threw herself into untangling the town's financial records. The small office adjacent to the town hall became her sanctuary, a place where her silence was an asset rather than a liability. Numbers didn't care if she couldn't speak. They revealed their secrets to her just the same. Dawson stopped by occasionally, sometimes bringing her a cup of coffee or simply checking to see if she needed anything. His presence was never intrusive, his conversation never demanding. He seemed to understand her need for space while still offering quiet companionship. One afternoon, as Harper was deep in concentration over a particularly confusing set of tax records, a shadow fell across her desk. Looking up, she found not Dawson's friendly face but the leering countenance of Jasper Wilkes, the saloon owner who had laughed at her request for employment. "Well now," Wilkes drawled, leaning too close, the smell of whiskey heavy on his breath. "Ain't you a pretty little thing when you're all serious with your numbers?" Harper stiffened, her hand instinctively reaching for her slate to ask him to leave, but Wilkes snatched it away. "Don't need this between us," he said, tossing the slate aside. "I got a proposition for you that don't require talking." Harper's heart hammered in her chest as Wilkes reached for her arm. She jerked back, knocking over her chair as she tried to put distance between them. When Wilkes advanced again, Harper grabbed the heavy ledger and held it before her like a shield. The door swung open with force, hitting the wall with a bang that made them both jump. Dawson stood there, his normally calm demeanor replaced by cold fury. "Is there a problem here, Wilkes?" His voice was deadly quiet. Wilkes straightened, a smirk hiding his momentary uncertainty. "Just getting acquainted with our new bookkeeper. No law against being friendly." "Looks to me like your kind of friendly isn't welcome," Dawson said, stepping into the room. "Miss Lyndon has work to do. You'd best be on your way." Something in Dawson's stance made Wilkes reconsider whatever retort he'd been about to make. With a forced laugh, he headed for the door. "No harm done. We'll continue our conversation another time, Miss Lyndon." When he was gone, Dawson retrieved Harper's slate from the floor. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern etched across his features. Harper took the slate with trembling hands and wrote, "Yes, thank you. Wilkes's trouble, Dawson said, helping her right her overturned chair. But even he knows better than to cross certain lines in this town. If he bothers you again, you come find me or the sheriff. Harper nodded, fighting to calm her racing heart. After a moment's hesitation, she wrote, "How did you know?" "I didn't," Dawson admitted. Was heading to the livery when Mrs. Winters mentioned seeing Wilkes come this way. Something didn't sit right. He shifted uncomfortably. "I don't mean to interfere in your business, Harper, just want you to know you've got friends here." The word friends made Harper pause. It had been so long since she'd allowed herself to think anyone could be a friend, not with the walls she'd built around herself. That night, Harper couldn't sleep. Memories she tried to bury surged to the surface, the fire that had claimed her parents' home and their lives while she'd been trapped inside. The smoke damage that had left her vocal cords scarred beyond repair. The whispers and stares that had followed her in St. Louis until she couldn't bear it anymore. Dawn found her exhausted but resolute. She would finish her work for Promise Creek, collect her pay, and move on as she had planned. Forming attachments, even friendships, only led to more pain when it came time to leave. But as the days passed, Harper found leaving Promise Creek increasingly difficult to contemplate. Mrs. Winters had taken to leaving fresh flowers in her room. Mr. Peterson at the cafe saved the corner table for her each morning, understanding her preference for quiet. And Dawson. Dawson had become a constant, steady presence, never pushing but always there. One evening, as Harper was locking up the office, Dawson appeared with his horse saddled behind him. "Beautiful evening for a ride," he said by way of greeting. "There's a spot not far from town, best view of the sunset you'll ever see. Would you like to come?" Harper hesitated. Going meant acknowledging this connection between them, this fragile thing that felt dangerously like trust. "Just as friends," Dawson added, seeming to sense her uncertainty. "Promise to have you back before dark." Harper wrote on her slate, "I don't ride well." "That's all right," Dawson said with a smile. "Samson here is gentle as they come. You can ride with me." Harper studied him, searching for any sign of deceit or hidden motive. Finding none, she slowly nodded. The ride was peaceful, Dawson's strong arms holding the reins on either side of her, creating a sense of security she hadn't felt in years. True to his word, the spot he'd chosen offered a spectacular view of the setting sun painting the desert landscape in hues of gold and crimson. They sat on a blanket Dawson had brought, sharing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried fruit. As the first stars began to appear, Dawson broke their companionable silence. "I came west after the war," he said quietly. "Couldn't stand the fighting anymore, even after it was supposed to be over." "Too many ghosts back east," he glanced at her. "Guess we all carry something, don't we?" Harper stared at the darkening sky, then slowly reached for her slate. Instead of writing a response, she found herself drawing quick, sure strokes that formed a small house engulfed in flames. Dawson watched without comment as she added 2 figures inside the inferno and 1 outside, her hand trembling slightly as she worked. When she was done, she held the slate out to him. "Your parents?" he asked gently. Harper nodded, tears threatening to spill. "And you survived," Dawson stated rather than asked, his voice soft with understanding. "Is that why you don't speak?" She took the slate back and wrote beneath her drawing, "Smoke damage, vocal cords scarred." "I'm sorry," Dawson said simply. Harper wrote again, "Not your fault." "Doesn't have to be my fault for me to be sorry it happened to you," he replied. After a moment, he added, "Thank you for showing me." They rode back to town in silence. But it was a different quality of quiet than Harper was used to, not the isolation of her self-imposed exile, but something shared and strangely comforting. As spring gave way to summer, Harper's temporary position became permanent. The town council, impressed with her work straightening out years of financial tangles, hired her officially as Promise Creek's treasurer and bookkeeper. Her friendship with Dawson deepened gradually, built on small shared moments: his visits to her office, occasional rides to watch the sunset, Sunday dinners at Mrs. Winters' boarding house, where he seemed to always have a seat saved next to hers. One afternoon in late summer, Dawson arrived at her office looking unusually serious. "Got a letter today," he said without preamble. "Army's setting up a new fort 50 miles west. They're looking for a blacksmith." Harper felt her heart constrict painfully. She had known this would happen eventually. People always left. She kept her expression neutral as she wrote, "Good opportunity for you." Dawson watched her for a long moment. "I turned it down." Harper's head snapped up in surprise. She wrote, "Why, better pay, steady work." "Got steady work here," Dawson replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "Got reasons to stay." Before Harper could respond, the door burst open and Sheriff Tanner rushed in. "Miller, need you now. Stage was robbed coming in from Tucson. Drivers hurt bad." Dawson was on his feet immediately. "Coming." He glanced back at Harper. "We'll finish this conversation later." But later never came. As word spread about the stage robbery, Promise Creek erupted into chaos. The driver had died of his injuries, and the passengers reported 3 masked men who had seemed to know exactly where the strongbox was hidden. Days passed with Dawson working alongside the sheriff to track the robbers, returning to town only briefly to check on things at his shop before heading out again. Harper caught glimpses of him exhausted, determined, focused on the task at hand. A week after the robbery, Harper was working late when the office door creaked open. Expecting Dawson, she looked up with a smile that quickly faded when she saw Jasper Wilkes and 2 unfamiliar men. "Evening, Miss Lyndon," Wilkes said, his voice overly pleasant. "My associates and I need access to the town safe." Harper shook her head firmly, reaching for her slate. "Now don't be difficult," Wilkes continued, his tone hardening. "We know you have the combination. Open it nice and quiet and no one gets hurt." Harper's blood ran cold as realization dawned. "The stage robbery, these were the men responsible." She wrote quickly. "Sheriff has the combination." "Now that's a lie," one of Wilkes' companions said, stepping forward threateningly. "Town treasurer has access. That's you, little lady." Harper's mind raced. The safe contained not only town funds but also the recovered strongbox from the stage, being held as evidence. She stood slowly, trying to appear cooperative while gauging the distance to the door. "Smart girl," Wilkes said with a smirk. "The safe, if you please." Harper moved toward the safe but stopped short, suddenly turning and hurling her heavy ledger at the nearest man. In the moment of confusion, she bolted for the door, only to be caught by Wilkes, who grabbed her roughly by the arm. "That was stupid," he snarled, all pretense of civility gone. "Open the safe," or the sound of a hammer being cocked stopped him mid-sentence. Dawson stood in the doorway, his revolver aimed steadily at Wilkes. "Let her go," he commanded, his voice like steel. "Miller," Wilkes said with forced casualness, "this isn't what it looks like." "Looks like you and your friends robbed the stage and killed Tom Jenkins," Dawson replied evenly. "And now you're trying to get the evidence against you." The tension in the room was palpable as the men weighed their options. Then, with frightening speed, the man nearest Dawson drew his gun. What followed was chaos. Harper found herself shoved to the floor as gunshots exploded in the small office. Wood splintered, glass shattered, and someone cried out in pain. When silence finally fell, Harper raised her head to see Wilkes and one of his men dead, the third slumped against the wall clutching a bleeding shoulder. Dawson was leaning heavily against the doorframe, his left arm hanging limply at his side, dark blood staining his shirt. "Harper," he said, his voice strained but relieved. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head frantically, rushing to his side. Blood was seeping through his shirt at an alarming rate. "Sheriff's coming," Dawson managed before his knees buckled. Harper caught him as best she could, easing him to the floor as footsteps and shouts filled the street outside. Looking into his ashen face, something broke inside her, the dam she had built around her emotions, her voice, her heart. "Stay with me," she whispered, the sound barely audible, painful and rusty from disuse. "Please, Dawson, stay." His eyes widened in shock before clouding with pain. "Harper," he murmured before losing consciousness. The next few hours were a blur. "Doctor." Bennett worked to remove the bullet from Dawson's shoulder while Harper paced outside, her throat burning with the effort of those few spoken words, her mind consumed with fear for the man who had somehow breached her carefully constructed walls. "He'll live, Doctor," Bennett announced finally, wiping blood from his hands. "Lost a fair amount of blood, but the bullet missed anything vital. He's tough." Harper nodded gratefully, tears streaming down her face. "He's asking for you," the doctor added gently. Dawson lay pale against the sheets, but his eyes were clear when she entered. "You spoke," he said weakly. Harper nodded, taking his hand in hers. She reached for the slate hanging at her waist and wrote, "Hurts to talk, but trying." "No rush," Dawson replied, squeezing her hand. "Got all the time in the world now." Recovery was slow for both of them. Dawson's physical wounds healed gradually under Dr. Bennett's care and Harper's watchful eye. Harper's journey back to speech was equally painstaking, working with exercises the doctor suggested, forcing painful sounds past damaged vocal cords, learning to communicate again after years of silence. Autumn painted Promise Creek in shades of gold and russet as Harper sat beside Dawson on the porch of Mrs. Winter's boarding house, enjoying the afternoon sun. Their relationship had deepened during his recovery, unspoken feelings finally acknowledged in quiet moments of shared vulnerability. "I never thanked you," Harper said, her voice still rough but stronger than it had been, each word a victory hard won. "For what?" Dawson asked, looking up from the leather he was tooling a new hobby during his convalescence. "Listening," she replied simply. "Even when I couldn't speak." "You heard me anyway." Dawson set aside his work and took her hand. "Some things don't need words, Harper, but I'm glad to hear your voice all the same." She smiled, a full, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I'm still trying to find it again, my voice, who I am now." "You never lost who you are," Dawson said with quiet conviction. "Just how you showed it to the world." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket. "I've been waiting for the right moment to give you this." In his palm lay a delicate silver ring set with a small turquoise stone. "It was my mother's," he explained, suddenly looking nervous. "I know it's not fancy, but it's perfect," Harper interrupted, her voice breaking with emotion rather than damage. "I love you, Harper Lyndon," Dawson said, his eyes holding hers. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she whispered, then repeated more strongly, "Yes." Their wedding in the town church that December was a simple affair. Harper wore a cream-colored dress with a blue sash that matched her eyes, and Dawson stood tall and proud in a new suit, his arm fully healed and strong again. When it came time for her vows, Harper took a deep breath and spoke clearly, each word deliberate and precious. "I, Harper, take you, Dawson, to be my husband. You heard me when I was silent. You stood by me when I was broken. You loved me when I couldn't love myself. I promise to stand by you, speak for you when needed, and love you for all the days of my life." Tears glistened in Dawson's eyes as he replied with his own vows, his voice steady and sure as it had been that first day when he'd offered help to a silent stranger. Spring found them in a small house at the edge of town, built by Dawson's hands with help from half the men in Promise Creek. Harper continued her work as town treasurer, but now she also kept books for several businesses, her reputation for accuracy and honesty spreading to neighboring settlements. On warm evenings, they would sit on their porch watching the desert sunset, sometimes talking, sometimes enjoying comfortable silence. Harper's voice grew stronger with each passing month, though she would always speak with a slight rasp that Dawson claimed was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. One such evening, as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Harper turned to her husband with a nervous smile. "I have something to tell you," she said, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on her stomach. Dawson's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Harper, are you?" She nodded, her voice steady and clear as she said the words that completed their journey from silence to symphony. "We're going to have a baby." Dawson gathered her in his arms, his joy too great for words. In that moment, under the vast Arizona sky, Harper knew she had found not just her voice but her home in Promise Creek in Dawson's love. And in the future they would build together, one word, one day, one precious moment at a time. Years later, Harper would tell their children the story of how she had arrived in Promise Creek believing she had no voice, and how their father had listened until she found it again. She would teach them that true listening is an act of love, that silence doesn't mean emptiness, and that sometimes the most important words are the ones that take the longest to say. And on quiet evenings, when Dawson and Harper sat together watching their children play, their hands would find each other in a gesture that needed no words at all, a language of love they had created together, born in silence and flourishing in the light of all they had become.